Hello, welcome to Breaking Down ODE Social Studies Standards. I am Ivory Kennedy Jr., and we are going to be working with ODE Social Studies Standards, how to break them down and then create learning objectives and then give you a little bit of the next steps. The first thing that we are going to do, though, is learn about accessing ODE's website. There's a lot of different ways that you can get to the Social Studies Standards. So we are going to take a quick field trip. This is the homepage. And you are going to or can click on the Teachers tab and scroll down to Ohio Learning Standards. And this is going to populate everything that you need to know. Some of these standards are not just content specific, but actually have to do with social emotional learning standards, technology, so on and so forth. But again, we are working with social studies standards, so we're going to click that. And that is going to take us to all of this lovely information is available to you. You're going to click on model curricula. And if you look at this grid here, this big PDF is going to contain all of the social studies standards K through 12. And then they have them individually broken down into either Word documents. So if you click on the grade or the title of the class, it'll give you a Word document, or you can click on PDF. And that's what we are going to use today. We are using 8th grade social studies standards. So this is American history from the founding of the country all the way up into Reconstruction. And that is about the 1870s. And that's where, or that's the bandwidth that this class covers. So we are going to actually use standard 12 today. I want to call your attention to the strand here. So there are 4 different ways that the social studies standards are taught. I'm going to show you that here. So there are 4 different major parts of the social studies standards that you will have to see. So the first is the strand, which I kind of talked about. Then it goes into the topic, and then we have content statement, content elaboration, and then the expectation for learning. So I'm going to explain each of those as it relates to standard 12. So again, as you see up here, that is the history strand that we are working with, and the varying topics. So historical thinking and content skills, colonization to independence. Some of those topics are going to have multiple standards within them. It helps tell the story. A new topic here, it says a new nation. And again, all of this is under the history strand. So kind of telling the story. You have expansion, 2 standards relating to that. And then we get to the topic of Civil War and Reconstruction. So standard 12. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. So first, we have the content statement. Okay, we've established what the topic is. We have the strand as well. So now we're going to look at the content statement. This should be the driver of the lesson that introduces the direction for the lessons that follow with everything that you have to accomplish within the standard, because you can see it's pretty hefty. So we're going to start off by looking at the content statement. I usually have my students read these aloud. So disputes over the nature of federalism, complicated by economic developments in the United States, resulted in sectional issues, including slavery, which led to the American Civil War. So there's a lot to unpack there, and that's what the content elaboration is for. So using all of this, first, you have to make sure that you know the information inside of it. So a lot of the times watching documentaries and finding documents on the Library of Congress's website helps a lot in terms of familiarizing yourself, and not to forget about the vocabulary that is needed to understand as well. So if you look here, there is a lot to accomplish. We have kind of an opening statement. The federal system of government created by the Constitution raised questions during the first half of the 19th century over the power of the federal government versus the powers reserved to the states. States' rights arguments were first outlined in the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution of 1798-99. So I would first start with that if I were breaking this down in front of my students. But I've created a graphic that I hope is useful for you. This is sort of how I break down the standards. Let me see if I can maximize this. Give me 1 second. We're going to expand this for full view here. So it might be a little bit hard to read. All of this comes from the standard that we just went over, okay? So I have the content statement here at the top. I've broken this down into 3 different topics within what we've discussed about Standard 12. So over here to the right, I have sectional issues. So I've broken that down with tariff and policy. And a little question here, how to get better in terms of selling land and where to go with slavery. Then you have states' rights. So the 2 topics that were within that was the tariff of abomination and the nullification crisis of 1832 to 33. And then you have the 3rd topic within the standard, laws and changes about slavery. So the Missouri Compromise, the Wilmot Proviso, Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas and Nebraska Act. So going back to the standard, we have to accomplish all of this and come to the conclusion with the expectation for learning. So at the end of this standard, whenever you finish with however many lessons you conduct with this standard, students should be able to compare the positions of sections of the United States on issues from the 1820s through the 1850s, and then summarize how disputes over the nature of federalism fed into sectional issues and helped lead to the Civil War. So your job is to make sure that they can do that. This is the content in the middle that we have to have understood in order to teach them to get to that final conclusion. So I'm going to take you on a journey of constructing those. But first, I want you to look at a couple of resources that we are going to use to get there. So breaking down the standard again, I have that expanded for you. We're going to take this, and this is going to be our driver. But first, we have to establish what Bloom's verbs are and how we use those to make sure that we teach effectively. So if you look at the top, Bloom's verbs are broken down into 6 categories. Remember, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and then creating. So this is kind of the flow in which you want to teach your students. They should be remembering from prior knowledge, things that have happened already to help them eventually understand what is happening, take that understanding and apply it to whatever it is that you're teaching them. And then for them to be able to do both analyze, so break down what it is that they see, evaluate it and make judgments on that, critique it, and at the end, have them be able to produce something by creating something at the end of your standard to assure that they were able to complete and understand the concept. So learning objectives. You always are going to start with the acronym we say SWABAT or SWABAT, and that's just students will be able to. Okay. After that, your learning objectives are going to follow using one of these Bloom's verbs, and then whatever it is after that, which helps you develop your full learning objective, as long as you're using those 6 Bloom's taxonomy pillars. So now we are going to take a second and construct these learning objectives together. So I'm going to use the illustration that I showed you all, and I'm going to split screen that and create some learning objectives using that. So if you take a look here, we have the 3 topics that we broke those down. I started off with the essential learning objectives. So remember at the beginning, it mentioned the Virginia and Kentucky resolution. So I put students will be able to differentiate the Virginia and Kentucky resolution of 1798 to 99 compared to the current state of the country. So thinking about this, students will have to recognize and remember what that resolution was as it relates to states' rights, and then be able to determine where it is the country happens to be at the current time period. So significant events have happened from the 1700s to the 1800s, which leads us to the Civil War. So looking at the sectional issues, knowing that I have to talk about tariffs, knowing that we have to talk about the changes of policy, the ideas of land. We are going to go here with sectional issues, learning objective 1. Students will be able to identify the role of money via tariff policy and national bank issues or national banking issues. So this is going to help you be able to determine what those sectional issues were as it related to, again, pulling this straight from the standard, the tariff policies, what was going on with the national bank. So you want to make sure that you take students along the journey of understanding what this aspect has to do with these sectional issues. So identify would be a good Bloom's verb to use there. The second learning objective that we are going to create using just this first piece of the standard, students will be able to compare the positions of Northern and Southern people relating to the land and point of view on slavery. So you could even say relating to the selling of land or the importance of land, and then their point of view on slavery. Because it's important to note that not everybody condoned slavery. Not everybody had enough money in the South to do that in the first place. So that would be something that I make sure that students gain perspective on. And if you can see in the middle of this states' rights piece here, I have perspective. I think perspective kind of covers this whole thing. It covers history. So you're going to want to make sure that your students can compare the different positions that people had on these things as it relates to the sectional issues. All right. So moving into the middle, the states' rights. So making sure, again, that essential learning objective with the Kentucky and Virginia resolution. And you mentioned that with states' rights as well, to make sure that they understand how the federal government and state government has evolved from that time period. But as it relates to states' rights, we have two things going on that they really want us to know. The state of Ohio wants us to make sure we hit at the tariff of abomination and the nullification crisis of 1832 to 33. So what I wrote there was, what are the reasons that can be understood on both sides of history and both sides of the money? And then I have perspective again. So thinking about how we can build on what we've taught with the sectional issues and money, and then move into the evolution of states' rights. So looking at this, I decided that we can start to build. I want to have students illustrate. So students will be able to illustrate the concept of states' rights with the decision of the tariff of abominations. So students obviously need to be able to understand what that is. So you're going to make sure that they get that. But at the end, you want them to illustrate the concepts that state rights started to evolve into. And then same with the nullification crisis. So again, perspective is key here. So students will be able to justify the nullification crisis of 1832 to 33 from multiple perspectives. Again, bringing in that perspective piece to make sure that we are keeping humanity at the front of social studies, but also being real about what has happened in the events that led to eventual civil war, as the standard is asking us to do. Lastly, we're going to look at the law changes about slavery. So looking at the law changes, laws of the land and expansion of the institution, and that institution would happen to be slavery. So you have four things that you have to make sure students understand, or four subtopics within this: Missouri Compromise, the Wilmot Proviso or the Proviso, and then Compromise of 1850 and Kansas and Nebraska Act. So it is critical that you are aware of the ins and outs of all four of those things as it relates to the timeline of the United States heading into the Civil War. So identifying those reasons, again, taking us back to that content standard or content statement, it's this dispute over the nature of federalism, who has the most power, who should have the most power. Complicated by economic developments. One of the major things is taxes, tariffs, and slavery and policy going into these decisions that lead us into different sectional issues. The North obviously does not participate in slavery because the South is more expansive in terms of its land and the climate, so on and so forth. And your students should have understood that up until this point. So reminding yourself that this should be a continuation of the American story, but given the specifics in terms of how we have gotten to this point in history. All right. So including the issues of sectional issues, slavery, which lead to the Civil War. So we're not there yet, but we're telling the story that gets us there. So these law changes about slavery, learning objective 1, students will be able to construct an argument about the changes to the country under the Missouri Compromise and Wilmot Proviso. So you could take both of those. talk about them in a myriad of ways and be able to come up with an activity of some sort that allows your students to construct arguments explaining how the country is actually changing with the laws being passed by the government. So making sure not only do they get how this process works back then, but relating it to now. When Congress passes a bill, when the Senate has to vote on it and the president signs it, this is the kind of connection you want to make sure that you make as our government functions today and how we've used that same government to function in this time period like this. So drawing those connections and helping students be able to construct an argument about those changes would be very beneficial. And then our last learning objective for this lesson, students will be able to create a multimodal presentation about the attempts of expansion and banning of slavery regarding the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then since this is a creating perspective, students could be really reaching with all of what you've already taught them for this creation with the attempts of passing and maybe the potential banning of slavery, and then how that leads us into a civil war. So looking at the left side, the expectation for learning, remember, they wanted us to be able to, or students to be able to compare the positions of sections of the United States on issues from the 1820s through the 1850s. Through all of your Bloom's verbs here with the learning objectives created, they should be able to do that. And then summarize how disputes over the nature of federalism fed into sectional issues and helped lead to the American Civil War. So obviously you're going to talk about the expansion of slavery, those abolitionists that were fighting against that, the treatment of those people being sold and moved and abused and not being paid by the United States, right? Being excluded from the Constitution. Those are things you want to make sure that you get in your video or that you get in your lesson so that these things make sense to the students, and it makes sense to the story of the United States coming to a war with itself. People like John Brown you could mention with the Kansas and Nebraska Act, and this is going to lead you into other things. So we're going to jump back into the PowerPoint as we conclude here. So ideas of where to go with the activities. So obviously this is a non-exhaustive list, and you need to make sure that any way that you are teaching your students social studies is creative and engaging. So I just listed a few things that I have been successful with in my career. So whether that's lectures, guided notes, you can be doing guided notes with your lectures as you're talking. Students have to write things down, but they're interactive in ways that maybe stop and pause, have comprehension questions embedded within them. There's a myriad of ways to be able to do lectures, interactive lectures, guided notes, so on and so forth. Videos and documentaries. We don't want to be social studies teachers that are just front facing, but we also want to balance between showing too many videos and documentaries. Be specific in how you show your students the media that they are going to be exposed to in your classroom as it relates to the standards. Don't forget about vocabulary. There are lots of things within this standard that I would be defining. I would do the definition of federalism, make sure that students understand what sectional issues mean. What is a tariff? What does nullification mean? Getting to the basic element of a compromise. Think about all of the definitions that go into making sure you understand. Group work, interactive readings, make sure that you have scholarly readings that are appropriate to grade level. Skits, plays, field trips, projects, whether that be place-based projects or projects that involve the community. Papers, writing a paper is never bad. Letters from different perspectives, bringing guest speakers in that talk about history, community engagements, and civil participation. And then just generational connections. What can you rely on? Do you have any students that may have any grandparents that could tell some pretty cool stories as well? Because social studies is all about perspectives. So I hope that this video was engaging. I hope that you were able to understand what it takes to break down those standards. Again, we go from the strand, the topic. That topic is going to be our driver, or the topic is going to vary with the strands. That is the theme. So the topics are going to help us tell the story. They're going to keep us on track with the development of the United States. as it relates to the 8th grade standards. I'm pretty sure that's standard across the board. The content statement is going to be the driver of the lesson that introduces you to the direction and the flow of where you're going to go with your lesson. Then you have the content elaboration, which is simply the meat of the material, where all of what is in that content elaboration needs to be taught and understood before moving on to the next. And that is the section where you're going to really develop the scope of the lessons. So again, never forget the activating of prior knowledge, as we did with the Virginia and Kentucky resolution of 1798 to 99. And then from there, you're going to make sure you include your Bloom's verbs, as at the end you saw for the expectation of learning, we had compare and summarize. So having those embedded in your learning objectives is going to be great for the students. I hope that you really had a good time talking about social studies, breaking some stuff down and creating learning objectives for our students to accomplish. Take care.